In the vast, sun-scorched heart of the Chihuahuan Desert, there is a place where the wind moves but carries no sound, where compasses spin like dancers lost in madness, and where even time itself seems to hesitate. For generations, whispers have told of strange lights that move with purpose, voices carried through the silence, and ancient bones that do not belong to us. Beneath the shifting sands, something waits, older than history, patient as stone, and watching. Tonight you will step into that place, and once you enter, the desert will not forget you. In the burning heart of the Chihuahuan Desert, there lies a stretch of earth that defies the natural order. A place where the wind moves freely, yet carries no sound. Where a man can speak to his companion a few steps away and hear nothing but the rush of his own heartbeat. Where the laws of direction and time seem to bend, as if the desert itself is playing a cruel trick. They call it la zona del silencio, the zone of silence. For those who have walked its cracked earth, the silence is not merely the absence of noise. It is a weight pressing on the skull, an invisible hand wrapping around the mind. It is the feeling that the world is watching you without eyes. The story begins in the summer of 1969, when a team of American scientists came chasing a fire that had fallen from the heavens. A meteorite, blazing bright enough to turn night into day, had streaked over the skies of Mexico before vanishing into the desert's vast emptiness. They arrived with radios, compasses, and instruments designed to measure every grain of sand and shift of the magnetic field. But soon they realized something was wrong. Radios that had been tested the night before went dead the moment the team entered the zone. Their compasses spun without pause, unable to find true north. Even the clock on their dashboard stuttered, as though hesitant to move forward in this place. The men laughed nervously at first, blaming the heat, the equipment, or perhaps a quirk of the desert's geology. Yet the longer they stayed, the heavier the air seemed to grow, as if something unseen was coiling around them. Local guides had warned them not to linger too long. Around campfires and in village squares, elders told the same story in many variations. That this land was cursed long before the meteor came. That the silence was not natural, but a punishment, born of an ancient sin, or perhaps a long-forgotten bargain between men and gods. Some claimed it began centuries ago, when the desert was not barren but lush, dotted with villages and temples. The people here worshipped a deity of the stars, one who could speak across the heavens. Priests would gather atop carved stone platforms, calling out to the skies, and the skies would answer. It was a bond unlike any other, but bonds can be broken. One night, the star god demanded a gift it had never asked for before, the life of the high priest's only daughter. The priest refused. In his defiance, he shattered the covenant, and the god turned its face away. The rains stopped, the rivers turned to dust, and a deep silence fell upon the land. A silence so complete, even prayers could not pass through it. The villages crumbled, the temples fell, and the wind began to move without carrying a single whisper. The few who survived fled, never to return, except those who could not resist the pull of what was lost. The scientists, of course, knew nothing of this when they arrived. They did not believe in curses, only in causes. But as the days wore on, their work slowed. They began to hear strange things at night, not in the air, but inside their heads. A soft hum, too steady to be the wind. Sometimes it sounded like voices, speaking in a language they could not understand. The desert was alive, yet not in any way they had ever known. One evening, while the sun was bleeding into the horizon, the lead geologist, Dr. Harrington, wandered further than usual. He was a practical man, one who believed only what could be weighed or measured. But when he reached a shallow depression in the sand, his boots struck something hard, metallic. Brushing away the dust, he uncovered a fragment of what looked like rock, but shimmered faintly as if lit from within. It was smooth, too perfect to be natural, and warm to the touch, though the evening air had already grown cool. He brought it back to camp, where the others examined it in silence. They took samples, scraped shavings, and found the composition unlike any earthly metal. Harrington kept it close, tucked into the pocket of his field jacket. That night, he dreamed of standing on a vast plain beneath a sky filled with stars he did not recognize. 3 tall, pale figures stood before him, their faces hidden in shadow, their voices low and urgent. He could not remember the words when he woke, but the feeling remained. They had given him a warning. Days passed, and the team's instruments continued to fail. Their food supplies began to dwindle, though they had planned for twice as long a stay. Worse, the silence was changing them. They no longer spoke unless necessary, and when they did, their voices were quieter, as though they feared to wake something sleeping beneath the sand. On the seventh night, the wind came, strong and sudden, rattling the tents and sending sand spiraling into the air. It carried with it a faint, rhythmic pulse, almost like a heartbeat. One of the men, Alvarez, claimed he could hear words inside it, urging them to leave. Another, Jensen, swore he heard his own name whispered again and again until it became unbearable. The next morning, Alvarez was gone. No footprints, no signs of struggle, only his tent, neatly zipped, and his belongings left untouched. The team searched for hours, calling his name until their throats were raw, but the desert gave no answer. In desperation, they climbed a low ridge to scan the horizon. There, far in the distance, they saw a figure walking slowly into the white glare of the afternoon sun. It might have been Alvarez. It might have been no one at all. Harrington tried to radio for help, but his words dissolved into static. Even the emergency beacon refused to transmit. Finally, as the sun began to sink once more, a faint signal broke through, a voice at the edge of hearing. It was a single sentence, half drowned in interference. "We found it's moving," the silence, and then nothing. That was the last anyone heard from the team. Days later, a search party arrived to find the camp abandoned. Tents still standing, equipment neatly packed, the meteorite fragment missing. The footprints led in every direction, as though each man had walked away alone into the endless desert. Locals shook their heads when they heard the news. They spoke of the curse again, of the god who had taken back its voice, and of the people it still claimed in payment. To them, it was not surprising. The zone had always been hungry. It was not a place you visited, it was a place that chose you. Some say Harrington's journal was found years later, buried in a tin box beneath a rock cairn. Most of its pages were filled with sketches of strange constellations, maps of impossible lands, and symbols no one could decipher. But one entry, written in hurried strokes, stood apart. It is not silence. It is listening. Even now, travelers report strange happenings when they stray too close. Radios sputter and die. Compasses twirl like dancers in a mad circle. The hum returns, low and steady, carrying the echo of voices that sound almost familiar. The desert has many secrets, but the Zone of Si-lence holds one unlike any other, a secret too vast, too patient, to be uncovered in a single lifetime. And somewhere, perhaps buried deep beneath the shifting sands, the fragment still waits, glowing softly in the dark, waiting for the next voice it will swallow whole. And so the question remains, was the meteorite in 1969 truly the beginning? Or was it only the latest reminder of something far older, something that has always been there, beneath the skin of the desert, waiting for men to come close enough to hear nothing at all? Before you decide, listen carefully. For in that place where the wind moves but no sound follows, there is always something else listening back. The silence, after all, has never been empty. It has simply been waiting for you. In the days before steel rails cut across the land, before telegraph lines carried voices over mountains, the Chihuahuan Desert was a vast and unforgiving ocean of stone and sand. Travelers called it La Terra sin Piet, the land without mercy. And yet, across this hostile expanse, there were always those willing to risk everything for the promise of wealth. In the winter of 1848, a caravan of traders set out from the silver mines of Durango, their wagons heavy with ingots bound for the markets of the north. There were 20 carts in all, each drawn by sturdy mules, each guarded by men who had seen death more than once and survived it. They carried muskets, sabers, and enough ammunition to fight off any bandits or desperate travelers. Their leader, Don Esteban Rojas, was a man whose reputation was as solid as the silver he transported, ruthless in negotiation, but fair to his men. The journey began without incident. By the second week, The caravan had crossed dry riverbeds, skirted jagged ridges, and followed the faint trails left by generations of traders before them. The men knew the desert's moods, its sudden heat, its chilling nights, its way of luring the unwary into false confidence. But nothing in their years of travel prepared them for what lay ahead. On the 15th day, they entered a stretch of land no map recorded, a flat expanse where the horizon seemed to shimmer and blur. The air was unnaturally still, and the mules began to snort and toss their heads as if smelling something foul. The men spoke little, their voices muted as though swallowed by the vastness around them. Esteban, an experienced navigator, noticed something strange. His compass needle quivered without pointing in any fixed direction. That night, the camp was restless. The guards swore they heard the sound of distant bells, faint but insistent, though no settlement lay within 100 miles. Some said it was the wind playing tricks, others whispered of El Llamado, the call, an old superstition among desert travelers, a sound meant to lure the living away into the dark. The next day began with clear skies. By midday, however, the light dimmed. A strange wall of yellow haze rose on the horizon, rolling toward them with unnatural speed. It was not the ordinary wind-driven dust storm they knew. The front moved without sound. Even the mules stopped braying, ears pinned flat, eyes wide with terror. Within minutes, the caravan was engulfed. The world vanished into a swirling void of sand and grit. Men clung to the sides of wagons, shouting commands that died inches from their lips. The storm did not howl. It pressed down with silence so thick it seemed to smother thought itself. The air grew cold, and the light took on a greenish pall, like the bottom of the sea. Esteban fought to keep his men together, but the shapes of wagons and riders became distorted, bending and stretching as though seen through water. He glimpsed figures moving between the carts, too tall, too still to be his men. Pale outlines with elongated heads, watching silently before vanishing into the shifting haze. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm ended. The air cleared, revealing the desert under a bruised evening sky. But the caravan was gone. Gone. Not destroyed, not overturned, gone. The wagons stood where they had been, perfectly upright. The mules remained tethered, their eyes vacant, as though their minds had been scraped clean. Yet every man had vanished. There were no footprints, no signs of struggle. Weapons lay untouched. Even the silver was still neatly stacked, as if awaiting inspection. When a search party arrived weeks later, they found the same sight: empty wagons, silent animals, and the scent of rain that had never fallen. The story spread quickly among the settlements, each telling adding its own flourish. Some claimed the men had been taken by spirits, others by travelers from the stars. In time, the legend became a warning to all who crossed that stretch of land. Avoid the place marked with the open eye. The open eye was a crude symbol drawn on maps by hand, always in the same location. Its meaning was uncertain. Some said it represented the gaze of the desert itself, always watching. Others believed it was the mark of the watchers, the tall, pale figures seen in the sandstorm. Over the decades, it appeared in diaries, on trade route charts, even etched into the walls of old way stations long since abandoned. And wherever the eye appeared, stories of disappearances followed. Years passed. The caravans dwindled as railroads carved their way across the land. The zone became a ghost of memory, its stories carried only by the oldest voices. But the land does not forget. In the spring of 1974, an archaeologist named Dr. Luisa Marin came to the desert chasing a rumor. She had been cataloging colonial-era trade routes when she stumbled upon a map sketched in faded ink, its edges burned as if rescued from a fire. Near the northern edge of the Chihuahuan Desert, she saw it, the open eye, drawn in bold strokes, surrounded by faint annotations in an archaic Spanish script. The note read simply, "Aquí, los hombres no regresan." Here, men do not return. Intrigued, Maureen traced the coordinates and found they matched the area known in whispers as the Zone of Si-lence. Determined to see the truth for herself, she journeyed to the edge of the zone with a small team and their equipment. The days were long, the air heavy with heat, but she felt a strange anticipation as they drew closer. Her instruments behaved strangely, GPS readings jumped erratically, compasses spun slowly without pause. The radios crackled with bursts of static, sometimes interrupted by faint voices speaking in syllables she could not place. On the fourth day, while scouting the base of an old, rusted radio tower near the zone's perimeter, she saw something that froze her in place. There, etched deep into the metal supports, was the symbol she had seen on the old map. The open eye. The lines were clean, deliberate, and far too precise to be the work of wind or weather. She ran her fingers over the grooves, feeling the cold bite of the metal. The mark had been made with care, perhaps with tools not meant for this age. That night, she dreamed of a caravan moving silently through the desert, its silver glinting in moonlight. The traders did not speak, their eyes wide and unblinking. At the head rode a man with a face half hidden in shadow, Esteban Rojas. He turned toward her, and in the moment before she woke, she saw that his eyes were not human at all, but twin pools of polished silver, reflecting an endless sky. When she awoke, the desert was still, but in the distance, faint and fleeting, she thought she saw the shape of a wagon moving through the haze. And so the legend deepened, not just a story of a vanished caravan, but of something older, something that marked the land with its gaze and took what it wished without warning. The open eye watches still, and now it had been found carved into the bones of the modern world. What it means and why it is there would take Maureen deeper into the zone than she had ever planned to go. And she would learn, soon enough, that some eyes never close. The Zone of Si-lence does not welcome signals. It devours them. Radios fall mute, compasses lose their loyalty to the north, and even a man's voice seems to falter, as if the air itself is reluctant to carry it. Yet, in rare moments, something does come through, not the ordinary hum of human communication, but bursts of sound that feel less like they were sent and more like they have always been there, waiting for the right ear to hear them. In the late summer of 1982, a scientist named Dr. Alan Whitford arrived at the zone's edge with one purpose: to prove the anomaly was purely geological. Whitford was not a man of superstition. He believed every strange story had a root in measurable fact. His hair was always tidy, his journals always neat, and his thoughts organized with the precision of a man who trusted numbers more than people. He brought with him a custom-built receiver, tuned to sweep through unused frequencies in the high and low bands. His goal was simple: monitor the electromagnetic patterns over several days and nights, compare them to known atmospheric phenomena, and write a paper that would politely dismantle decades of whispered legends. On the first 2 days, the data was quiet. The receiver hummed faintly in the background, recording static and faint noise from distant stations far beyond Mexico. Whitford noted occasional spikes in energy during afternoon heat surges, but nothing extraordinary. He slept each night with the dull satisfaction of a man whose expectations were being met. It was on the third night that the desert decided to speak. The sky had been restless since dusk. Heat lightning flickered far to the west, illuminating the silhouettes of mountains in brief, pale flashes. Whitford sat beside his receiver, making notes, when the static shifted. The sound did not fade in. It struck, sudden and sharp, like the snap of a wire pulled too tight. At first it seemed like simple interference, the kind that accompanies nearby storms. But then the pattern emerged. The bursts came in sequences: 2 clicks, 3 clicks, 5 clicks, then 8, 13, 21. Whitford's pen froze above the page. Prime numbers. Not random static, not the rolling crackle of thunder, but deliberate spacing, intentional order. He scribbled the sequence into his logbook, feeling an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. The bursts continued for nearly 2 minutes, then stopped as abruptly as they had begun. Outside, the horizon pulsed with white light from the storm, but no thunder reached his ears. The next night, the pattern returned. This time, between the bursts of numbers, there were faint sounds, syllables, half-formed words, spoken too quickly to catch. He played the recording again and again, slowing it down, filtering the frequencies, until something emerged. The syllables were not Spanish, nor English, nor any language he recognized. They rose and fell with a rhythm that felt almost human but carried an alien sharpness, as though the tongue that formed them was shaped differently from his own. Whitford began charting the timings. It was then he noticed something else. The transmissions coincided exactly with the flashes of lightning over the desert. Not before, not after, always at the precise moment the sky lit up, as though the signal was riding on the light itself. By the fifth night, he was no longer simply listening. He was waiting. His coffee went cold beside him as he stared at the receiver, pencil tapping the logbook. When the lightning came, so did the clicks, the numbers, and the strange language. But this time, the voice was clearer. It sounded closer, almost as though the speaker had stepped into the room with him. He felt a prickle at the back of his neck, the instinctive awareness that one is not alone. He glanced at the doorway, half expecting to see a shadow standing there. The doorway was empty, but the feeling lingered. Whitford began sending his own signals in reply. Using a small transmitter, he sent sequences of prime numbers, then waited. At first there was no change, but on the eighth night, the response shifted. Between the usual bursts, the unknown voice paused for several seconds, then returned, not with its strange language, but with his numbers, repeated back to him. The realization left him both exhilarated and uneasy. Something was listening. Something was choosing to answer. The more he engaged, the more the transmissions changed. Sometimes they came in the middle of the day, ignoring the pattern of lightning entirely. Other times, the voice would speak without numbers, a string of unbroken syllables that seemed to carry emotion, though he could not decipher their meaning. On the 11th night, a storm rolled directly over the zone. Lightning clawed across the sky in jagged arcs, and the receiver came alive with sound, bursts so rapid they blurred into a constant pulse. Whitford leaned close, adjusting the dial, when the signal abruptly shifted into something new. It was not static. It was not clicks. It was a single human voice. The voice spoke only one word, but it was enough to freeze him in place. "Stay." The word was whispered, yet it filled the room as though spoken inches from his ear. Every muscle in Whitford's body locked. He stared at the receiver, his breath shallow, the desert silent beyond the thin canvas of his tent. When the word ended, the signal went dead. The storm outside carried on without sound. Whitford never filed his report. His journals, his equipment, and his recordings were found weeks later at an abandoned camp near the zone center. The logbook ended mid-sentence, a line trailing off into nothing. The final page held only one entry, written in uneven strokes. "It knows I can hear it." And somewhere, in the deep frequencies that wander through the silence, the voice still waits, patient, deliberate, calling for the next listener to come close enough to understand. For the zone may swallow most signals, but those it allows through are never accidents. And once you hear it, you may find it has already heard you. There is a story told in hushed voices by those who have walked the zone of silence and returned, though never quite the same. It is not about the storms or the compasses or the strange signals from the sky. It is about the three strangers. Always three. Always together. Always gone before you truly know if they were ever there at all. The first account that survives comes from 1936 in the journal of a prospector named Mateo Ruiz. Mateo had been alone for 6 days, following a trail of rumors about silver veins hidden deep in the desert's folds. His water was running low. The sun, relentless and heavy, pressed against his back like a physical weight. By the 7th day, he was near collapse. It was then, just as the heat shimmer began to blur the horizon into liquid, that he saw them. 3 figures stood ahead, tall and impossibly still. They wore pale clothing that seemed untouched by the dust, and wide-brimmed hats that cast shadows over their faces. Mateo called out, and they turned to look at him. Their eyes were difficult to see in the glare, but their smiles were immediate, warm, and strangely knowing. Without a word, one of them extended a canteen. Mateo drank, the water cool and clear, more refreshing than anything he'd tasted in his life. When he looked up to thank them, the 3 strangers were already walking away, not hurried, but steady, in perfect unison. Mateo tried to follow, but within a few steps, they were gone, as if the desert had swallowed them whole. The next year, a pair of hunters from Coahuila claimed to have met the same trio. They had been tracking wild goats when they lost their bearings in a sudden sandstorm. The world turned a sickly yellow, the air thick enough to choke. When the storm broke, they found themselves disoriented and thirsty. That was when 3 tall figures emerged from behind a low ridge. Again, they offered water without speaking. Again, they vanished when the hunters glanced away for only a heartbeat. The details always matched. 3 figures, taller than most men, skin pale as moonlight, speaking flawless Spanish when they chose to speak at all. They asked no questions, offered no explanation, only the gift of water. Over the decades, hikers and travelers reported encounters that defied coincidence. In each telling, the strangers appeared in the most desperate moments, when heat threatened to take a life, when the compass needle spun endlessly, when the mind began to sink into the silence that the zone lays upon all who linger. But there was something else, something that began to unnerve those who studied the pattern. Witnesses often described the strangers' footprints in the sand. They were deep, too deep for their weight, as if each step pressed down with the force of something far heavier. Sometimes the footprints were oddly spaced, as though the legs that made them were longer than they should be. And on occasion, the prints did not taper at the heel like a human's, but ended in a smooth, rounded indentation. In 1992, a park ranger named Elena Carvajal, stationed at a conservation post near the zone's border, decided to follow up on these reports herself. She was young, skeptical, and convinced the stories were simply an embellishment of ordinary kindnesses, perhaps local nomads, perhaps reclusive desert wanderers. That changed when she encountered them herself. She had been out on patrol, checking for illegal campsites, when her Jeep's engine sputtered and died. The radio was useless, the battery inexplicably drained. She set out on foot, carrying a single bottle of water. The temperature soared above 100 degrees, and she knew the walk back to the station could easily kill her if she miscalculated. After 3 hours, when her lips were cracked and her vision swimming, she saw them. 3 figures, standing together on a rise, looking down at her as though they had been expecting her arrival. They were dressed in pale clothing, but their garments seemed finer than anything she had seen, smooth, almost luminous fabric that shifted with the light. Their skin was the color of bleached ivory. One of them, the tallest, spoke. "You are far from your road." His Spanish was flawless, almost too flawless, every syllable crisp. They gave her water. She drank greedily, then looked down at the bottle in her hands. It was not hers. It was made of glass, thick and cool, with no seam, no label. When she looked up again, they were already walking away. She called out, but her voice seemed to die in the air between them. She turned for only a moment to gather her pack. When she looked back, the rise was empty. Elena kept the bottle for years, hidden in her home. One day, without warning, it shattered into fine powder as she held it, slipping through her fingers like dry sand. More recent accounts have grown stranger. In 2011, a group of university students from Monterey went camping on the zone's outer edge. One evening, as the light drained from the sky, they spotted 3 figures walking along a distant ridge. One student, carrying a telephoto lens, snapped a photograph. They were certain they had captured the strangers, tall, pale, moving together like shadows in the dusk. But when they reviewed the photo later, their excitement curdled into unease. The image showed the desert ridge, the fading light, and 3 elongated shadows stretching across the sand. Yet there were no bodies to cast them. The photo circulated quietly among locals, never making it to any official archive. Those who saw it swore the shadows were wrong, too long, too thin, tapering to sharp points at the head, as though the figures were not entirely human. Some believe the 3 strangers are guardians of the zone, offering water not as kindness, but as a way of keeping their chosen alive until the desert decides what to do with them. Others claim they are travelers from a place far beyond the stars, appearing in threes because they are bound together in some ancient covenant. And there are those who whisper an older story still, that the strangers are the last priests of the god who once ruled the desert, the same god who took away its voice centuries ago. They wander in search of those who might restore the covenant, offering water as both gift and test. No one knows which is true. All that is certain is this: they appear when they wish, they vanish when they choose, and if you turn your back for even a second, you may never see them again. The desert is vast, but it remembers its own. And sometimes, it sends 3 shadows to remind you that you are never truly alone. In every official atlas, the Chihuahuan Desert is a place without a heart. Maps depict its boundaries in wide, lazy strokes, a wash of pale ochre and beige that bleeds into the white of unmarked terrain. Roads skirt its edges. Railways avoid its center. Survey lines vanish like water sinking into sand. But in whispered conversations among cartographers, military historians, and a few seasoned desert guides, there is talk of another map. A map not meant for public eyes. A map that claims the Zone of Si-lence is not a void, but a pattern, its very center marked by something impossible. The first mention came in 1964, in a letter recovered from the estate of a retired geologist named Rafael Benitez. It was addressed to a colleague in Madrid, and the ink had bled in places from desert humidity. "You will think me mad," it read, "but the document is real. The circles are precise. They call it El Corazón, the heart." For decades, the letter sat unnoticed in a dusty folder in a provincial university library. It would have stayed there if not for a theft in the summer of 2003. It happened inside the secure archives of Mexico's National Institute of Geography. A single locked drawer was forced open. Inside was an aged, oilskin-wrapped portfolio containing a dozen historical maps of northern Mexico, drawn between the late 1800s and mid-20th century. 11 of them remained. One was missing. The stolen map was said to be unlike the others. It bore no town names, no roads. Instead, it depicted the desert as a featureless expanse, save for a single set of concentric circles in its center, 5 rings, drawn with a draftsman's precision. Around the outermost ring, in faded pencil, someone had written, "Aquí, las brújulas mueren." Here, compasses die. When the theft was reported, most assumed it was the work of a collector of curiosities. Yet the man assigned to investigate, Inspector Tomás Cordero, quickly found reasons to doubt that theory. Witnesses described a visitor to the archive in the days before the theft, a thin, pale man with an accent no one could place. He signed the guest log with an illegible flourish and asked only to see maps of the area where the air has no sound. Cordero followed the trail for months, interviewing archivists, retired geographers, and old desert guides. The same phrases surfaced again and again: the heart, the circles, the place where no compass holds true. His search eventually led him to a forgotten storehouse in the mining town of Mapamay. Inside, beneath crates of obsolete surveying tools, he found a ledger belonging to an engineer named José Hidalgo. Hidalgo had been part of a government mapping expedition in 1932. His entries were brief, clinical, until the final page. July 17th, it read, "We reached the coordinates given to us by the captain. Instruments failed immediately. Compasses spun in slow arcs. Thermometers showed no change, yet the air felt heavy, like water. The captain forbade photographs. Said the circles were not for public record. We left in haste. My hands still feel the tremor." By then, the legend of the heart had taken shape in Cordero's mind. But he had no proof, only hearsay, a stolen map, and scattered fragments of testimony. That changed when he contacted a young astrophysicist named Dr. Isabel Lujan. Lujan was known for her work in mapping magnetic anomalies using satellite imaging. When Cordero shared the coordinates he'd pieced together from Hidalgo's notes, she hesitated. Then she pulled up a scan from her private files. The image was grainy, patched together from multiple passes of an aging satellite. But the pattern was clear. In the center of the zone's mapped boundary, the desert floor appeared to ripple outward in nearly perfect rings, visible only in the infrared spectrum. "It's geological impossibility," Lujan said, tapping the screen. "Perfect symmetry on this scale doesn't occur in nature without impact or intervention. But there's no crater, no uplift. It's as if the land was folded outward from a point we can't see." The two began to collaborate in secret. Cordero dug deeper into colonial archives, unearthing a 17th century Jesuit account of an enchanted plain, where travelers became lost though the horizon was always in sight. Luhan compared modern compass failure reports with the circle's dimensions. Every case of extreme magnetic deviation, compass needles spinning, GPS units freezing, fell within the second and third rings. The deeper they looked, the stranger the data became. During a 3-month observation window, the infrared rings appeared to drift, the entire formation shifting a few hundred meters eastward. When Luhan cross-referenced this with older scans, the pattern was undeniable. The heart was moving. No tectonic plate could explain it. No erosion model fit. It was as though the center of the zone was not a place, but a thing, slowly, deliberately changing its position. Cordero's obsession began to wear on him. He dreamed of the circles at night, sometimes seeing them not as markings on land, but as something carved into an immense, dark surface. In these dreams, the circles pulsed faintly, each beat accompanied by a deep vibration he could feel in his teeth. One evening, he received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a photograph printed on thick, yellowed paper. It showed the stolen map, its circles bold and black, and in the margin, a single line in Spanish: El corazón no quiere ser encontrado. The heart does not want to be found. When he showed it to Luhan, her face tightened. She had seen that handwriting before, in the margins of a set of declassified weather logs from the 1960s, kept by a U.S. Air Force meteorologist stationed near the zone. That man had vanished during a solo flight over the desert, his plane found weeks later with the cockpit empty and the radio still on. The warnings did not deter them. They decided to visit the coordinates marked by the most recent scans. The journey took them deep into the zone, where the ground cracked in wide, uneven plates and the silence pressed close enough to feel. Their compasses failed long before they reached the center. GPS units froze, showing only a blank screen. Luhan's magnetometer, designed to measure subtle shifts in the Earth's field, registered values that fluctuated wildly from moment to moment. When they finally stood where the innermost ring should have been, there was nothing unusual to the eye, just a flat stretch of sand and scattered rock. But the air felt dense, as if they were standing inside an invisible dome. In the stillness, Cordero thought he heard something, a low, rhythmic pulse, faint but insistent, like the echo of a drumbeat far underground. They marked the spot, took readings, and left before nightfall. 2 days later, when Luhan processed the satellite data from their visit, the coordinates of the heart had shifted again. This time, the movement was faster, over a kilometer eastward. The heart was moving toward the edge of the zone, toward places where people lived. The data was irrefutable. Whatever the heart was, it was not fixed. It was not passive. It was not bound to a single point in the desert. And if it continued to move at its current pace, it would be outside the zone within a decade. That night, Cordero dreamed again of the circles. But this time, they were no longer distant. They loomed above him, vast and blinding, each ring spinning slowly, drawing him inward. He woke with the sound of the pulse still in his ears, and the certainty that it was getting louder. Somewhere in the darkness of the zone, the heart was beating, and it was coming closer. Some places speak in whispers. The Zone of Si-lence hums. It is not a song in the air, not a vibration you can trace to any one place. It is something deeper, something that seems to rise from the bones of the earth itself, a steady, almost imperceptible pulse. Some hear it the moment they cross into the zone, a low, constant note that settles behind the ears and refuses to leave. Others swear they hear nothing at all, until they step outside its borders. Then, in the absence, they realize it had been with them all along. In 1998, a research team from Mexico City came to study what they believed to be a purely geological anomaly. Led by Dr. Gabriel Arriaga, an acoustic physicist with a taste for unexplainable data, they carried subsonic microphones, portable seismographs, and equipment designed to capture frequencies beyond the range of human hearing. Their plan was simple: record ambient sound levels at various points in the zone, compare them with control sites outside, and see whether magnetic anomalies had any influence on sound transmission. On their first night in camp, the wind was still. The air felt heavy, thick enough that even whispers seemed to move reluctantly. Arriaga sat alone with his headphones, listening to the deep earth recorders. What he heard was not silence. It was a tone, low, steady, almost mechanical in its perfection. It held no rhythm, no modulation, just a continuous hum that seemed to exist on the edge of perception. When he played it for the others, half the team nodded in recognition. Yes, they said they could hear it too. The other half frowned. They heard nothing. To them, the zone was as silent as legend claimed. Intrigued, Arriaga ran frequency analysis on the recording. The hum registered at 17 Hz, just below the threshold of conscious human hearing. Scientists call it infrasound, a range of frequencies often produced by earthquakes, storms, or massive machinery. But here in the zone, there were no quarries, no heavy industry, no tectonic rumbles. The source was nowhere to be found. As the days passed, the team noticed something stranger still. Those who could hear the hum began to change. Some became quiet and withdrawn, as though weighed down by invisible grief. Others grew restless, agitated, unable to sit still. One young researcher named Valeria described it as a hand on the back of my neck, guiding me forward. She said the hum was no longer just a sound, it was a presence, one that made her chest ache with a longing she could not name. Arriaga began measuring more than sound. He wired volunteers to EEG machines to track brain activity while they stayed within range of the hum. The results unsettled him. The brainwaves of each subject shifted, patterns of alpha and theta waves altered, as though the hum was bypassing ordinary sensory pathways and speaking directly to the nervous system. For some, the change produced calm, even bliss. For others, spikes of fear and anxiety. One man, a technician named Ignacio, experienced vivid waking dreams. He claimed to see a vast plain of black glass stretching to the horizon, with something pulsing beneath it like a heartbeat. When he described the pattern of pulses, Arriaga felt a chill. They matched exactly the oscillations of the hum. By the end of the second week, the team was fracturing. Those who could not hear the hum began to resent those who could, accusing them of exaggeration, of inventing symptoms for attention. Those who did hear it became protective of the sensation, even defensive when asked to describe it. One night, a storm moved over the zone. Lightning lit the desert in stark flashes, and for the first time, the hum shifted. It deepened, slowed, and in that moment, Valeria began to cry, not in pain, but in something closer to awe. She whispered, "It's speaking now." Arriaga asked her what it was saying. She shook her head. Not words. Not yet. The shift lasted only minutes before the tone returned to its steady drone. But something had changed in Valeria after that night. She began to walk alone at the edges of camp, standing still for long stretches with her eyes closed, as though aligning herself to something only she could feel. On the 15th day, before dawn, Ignacio found her at the perimeter, staring into the darkness. She was smiling, softly, almost peacefully. She told him the hum had called her by name. An hour later, she was gone. Her tent was neatly zipped. Her boots were missing, but her pack and canteen were untouched. There were footprints leading away from camp, deliberate and evenly spaced, heading straight into the open desert. They followed them for miles, until the sand grew too hard-packed to hold impressions. No other signs, no struggle, no sudden turn. Just a straight line, as though she knew exactly where she was going. She never returned. The team's remaining members left the zone soon after, their data incomplete. Arriaga tried to continue his work in the city, but the hum haunted him. In quiet moments, he thought he could still hear it, faint beneath the noise of traffic and daily life. Others from the team reported the same. For some, it faded after weeks. For others, it never left. Valeria's disappearance became another thread in the zone's tapestry of vanishing travelers. Locals shook their heads knowingly. The hum, they said, was not for everyone. If you heard it and loved it, it might keep you. Years later, satellite surveys would detect nothing unusual in the spot where she vanished. No change in elevation, no magnetic spike. But to those who had stood in that silent expanse, the absence of evidence meant nothing. The hum was still there, steady and patient, waiting for the next person who could hear it. And perhaps, somewhere in the depths of the zone, Valeria was still walking toward its source, smiling as she had that last morning, following the sound that was never really there. Long before the first cities rose from stone, before empires carved borders into the earth, the Chihuahuan Desert was not silent. It was alive with shapes and voices we no longer understand. What remains of them lies buried deep beneath the shifting sands of the zone, bones unlike any our species has known, guarded by legends as old as the stars themselves. The discovery began not with science, but with rain. In the summer of 1977, a rare storm swept across the desert, a downpour so sudden and violent that it carved new gullies in the baked earth. Days later, a rancher named Eduardo Vega noticed something glinting in the mud along a low arroyo. At first, he thought it was metal, maybe the remains of an old cart axle. But as he dug, his fingers struck bone. The shape was wrong from the start. The skull was long, unnaturally so, stretching backward in a taper that gave it an almost inhuman elegance. The eye sockets were large, the jaw narrow. And embedded in the ribcage, still locked between brittle bones, were shards of metal so smooth they looked as though they'd been poured into place. Vega, uneasy, loaded the remains into the back of his truck and drove them to the small regional museum in Mapamai. The curator, an older man named Castillo, called in a team from the National Institute of Anthropology. By the end of the week, a full excavation had begun at the arroyo. What they uncovered over the next 2 months would divide scholars for decades. There were more skeletons, 12 in total, each sharing the same elongated skulls and narrow frames. Some were intact, others broken into fragments by the centuries, but all bore the same metallic inclusions in their ribs and spines. Not rusted iron or corroded copper. These fragments shone even in the low desert light, untarnished by time. The excavation leader, Dr. Helena Cortez, kept her notes meticulous. She described the bone density as unusually high, the joint structures subtly different from modern humans. The elongated skulls, she noted, were not the result of cranial binding, an ancient practice that reshaped the head. These skulls had grown this way naturally. Local workers on the dig site refused to handle the bones without gloves, murmuring the old phrase, gente de las estrellas, star people. They told Cortez stories passed down through families for generations, that in an age before history, fire fell from the sky and brought with it tall, pale beings who walked among the early peoples. Some claimed the star people taught them how to track the seasons, how to draw water from deep underground, how to speak to the wind. Others whispered they had come to take something back, something buried in the desert long before any human set foot there. One story in particular unsettled Cortez. An elder from a nearby village told her that the star people had not all returned to the sky. Some had stayed behind, changed by the earth, becoming its guardians. They were still here, he said, watching over the place where their dead slept, ensuring no one disturbed the heart of the desert. Cortez listened politely, but her mind was on the analysis. Samples of bone were sent to laboratories in Mexico City and abroad. The metal fragments were tested as well, revealing a composition unlike any known alloy, part nickel, part an element that could not be identified, its spectral signature unrecorded in any database. Then came the carbon dating. When the results arrived, the technicians thought there had been a mistake. The oldest bones, they reported, were over 25,000 years old. That was impossible. At that time, human populations in the Americas were thought to be small, scattered, and recent arrivals. And yet here were skeletons, anatomically distinct, buried with technology unknown even to the ancient world. Cortez ordered a second round of testing. The results came back the same. One skeleton, partially fused with its metallic fragments, was older still, so old that its age skirted the edges of human prehistory. The news did not remain quiet for long. Word leaked, attracting the attention of journalists, fringe theorists, and government officials. Some claimed it was proof of extraterrestrial contact. Others dismissed it as an elaborate hoax. The excavation site became the center of a storm that had nothing to do with the weather. Then, without explanation, the dig was shut down. The official reason was erosion damage, but the workers knew otherwise. One morning, unmarked trucks arrived. Men in plain clothes loaded the bones and artifacts into sealed crates. The convoy left before noon. Cortez was ordered to turn over all field notes, sketches, and photographs. She complied, almost. In secret, she kept one small fragment of bone and a shard of the strange metal. For the rest of her life, she kept them hidden in a locked box beneath the floorboards of her home. She never spoke publicly about the discovery again, but in private, she told friends she sometimes dreamed of the skeletons. In her dreams, they were not lying in the ground. They were standing, tall and silent, watching her with eyes too large to belong to anything human. Behind them, the desert stretched endlessly, but above them, the sky was wrong. The stars were in patterns she did not recognize. Years later, a young archaeologist named Manuel Paredes, who had studied under Cortez, came across her unpublished notes. In the margins of one page, she had written a single line, "Older than cities. Older than memory. And they are not all dead." That last phrase stayed with him. Paredes began his own quiet investigation, tracing the movement of the crates removed from the dig. His search led to a remote government facility in northern Mexico, where access was restricted even to military personnel. No official records of the skeletons existed, but one night guard, speaking under the promise of anonymity, described specimens stored in a refrigerated vault. He said their bones were long, their skulls longer still, and their ribs shone faintly in the dim light. But the guard also claimed something else, that sometimes in the stillness of the night shift, he heard a faint humming from behind the vault door. Not the hum of machines, but something deeper, almost like a voice holding a single note for a very, very long time. Whether the skeletons were truly the remains of something not human, or simply an unrecorded branch of our own ancient family, no one outside those locked rooms knows for certain. The official stance remains that the zone's legends are nothing more than myths. But in the villages, the elders still speak of the star people, and they still leave offerings at the edges of the zone when the desert blooms after rare rains. For they believe the guardians are still there, not in the ground, but walking the desert's silent heart, their elongated shadows stretching across the sand under strange constellations, watching, waiting, remembering. And perhaps they wait for the day when we will uncover the rest of their bones, the ones still buried far deeper than any shovel has reached, bones that, if the stories are true, will prove the zone's oldest inhabitants were here before us, and perhaps, in a way we cannot yet understand, will be here long after we are gone. The day those bones see the light again will change everything we think we know about where we came from and where we are going. The desert remembers fire. Long before the first steel rails reached the edge of the Chihuahuan expanse, before scientists arrived with their compasses and radios, there were stories of burning stones that fell from the heavens and chose, without fail, to land in the same cursed stretch of earth. The Zone of Si-lence, they said, was a place the sky aimed for. There are 3 strikes that history records with precision, though whispers suggest there have been many more. The first was in the summer of 1938. The second, in the autumn of 1969. The third, in the spring of 1978. Each came without warning. Each landed within meters of the same point. And each brought with it a silence so complete that the world seemed to pause for breath. The 1938 fall was seen by a handful of ranchers and miners working the edges of the zone. It began as a single streak of light across the afternoon sky, not red like sunset, not gold like fire, but a white so pure it seemed almost blue. Witnesses said it moved slower than any falling star they had seen, as if it were descending with intention rather than tumbling. Just before it struck, every sound vanished. Horses froze mid-step. Tools stopped clinking against stone. Even the wind died. Then, without explosion or rumble, the light touched the desert floor. When the ranchers approached the site, the sand was hot enough to blister their skin. In the center was a shallow crater, and in it lay a fragment of something metallic. Not charred, not shattered, whole, as if it had been placed there rather than dropped from the sky. They left it where it was, afraid of what taking it might bring. By morning, it was gone. The second fall, in 1969, drew far more attention. It was witnessed by dozens, including a small convoy of scientists traveling toward the zone. They described the same unnatural light, the same frozen silence, and the same controlled descent. This time, the impact site was documented. Photographs show a crater no larger than a child's swimming pool, with a dark, oval-shaped object half buried in the center. The team that examined it reported it was warm to the touch, its surface smooth and unmarred. There were no seams, no signs of melting, no pitting from its journey through the atmosphere. When they tried to lift it, they found it heavier than its size should allow. It was taken away under military escort, its fate unrecorded. The third fall, in 1978, is the one people still talk about in the villages. It came at night, a flash so bright it turned the desert into day for 3 heartbeats. Those who saw it swear the light was not just above them but all around, as if the sky had opened. Again, the silence came, swallowing every living sound. Dogs stopped barking mid-howl. A man playing guitar in a roadside cantina plucked one last note and then sat frozen, unable to remember the song. This time, the object was found by locals before officials could arrive. 3 men carried it on a wooden stretcher to a nearby town. They said it seemed to hum faintly in their hands, though no one else could hear it. By morning, they were all sick, fevered, disoriented, unable to stand. Within a week, one was dead. The object, taken into government custody, was never seen again. For years, the 3 strikes were treated as separate incidents, each strange in its own right but unconnected. That changed in 1983, when an independent researcher named Arturo Salinas was granted access to fragments recovered from the 1938 and 1978 events. Under a microscope, he noticed something extraordinary. The edges of each fragment fit together perfectly, like adjoining pieces of a puzzle. The surfaces were so precise they joined without a visible seam. When he obtained high-resolution photographs of the 1969 object, he realized the same was true. All 3 were not random meteoric debris, but parts of a single whole. A whole that had been arriving in pieces, decades apart, each time to the same spot in the zone. This was no accident of gravity. Meteors do not target the same coordinates across 40 years. Meteors do not fall intact, without the violent fracture of impact. And they do not, above all, fit together like the bones of something being reassembled. Salinas became obsessed. He charted older accounts of falling stars in the region and found descriptions eerily similar to the 3 recorded strikes: white light, total silence, deliberate descent. Some dated back centuries, told by indigenous peoples who believed the desert was a meeting ground for the children of the sky. He began to suspect that the zone was not just a landing site but a destination, perhaps even a return point. That whatever the object was, it had been here before long ago and was now coming back in pieces. In the early 1990s, Salinas presented his theory at a small scientific symposium. Most dismissed it as speculation without evidence. But one man, a retired engineer who had worked on magnetic field mapping for the Mexican military, approached him afterward. He told Salinas that the coordinates of the meteor strikes matched the shifting position of the heart, the moving anomaly deep within the zone's center. If that was true, then the falls were not random. They were homing in on something beneath the desert, or perhaps something beneath the desert was calling them home. Salinas never had the chance to prove his theory. In 1994, he vanished during a solo trip into the zone. His vehicle was found abandoned, his notes scattered in the sand. The last page in his journal contained a hand-drawn diagram of the 3 fragments joined together. A shape neither purely mechanical nor organic, curved and smooth like a seed, but marked with lines too deliberate to be natural. At the bottom of the page, he had written one word: incomplete. Today, those who study the zone know the stories of the 3 falls. They also know that the desert still waits, and that one day, another piece will come down from the stars. Whether it is the last or merely the next, no one can say. But when it does, there will be silence. And in that silence, perhaps the desert itself will remember what it once received, and what it has been slowly, patiently putting back together. In the summer of 1983, 2 surveyors set out across the northern reaches of the Chihuahuan Desert, their boots crunching over salt-crusted earth, the early light stretching their shadows long behind them. Their names were Daniel Ortega and Miguel Rivas, childhood friends from the same dusty town, bound by years of shared work and trust. They had mapped roads together, measured riverbeds, charted canyons where no one else dared to walk. When the government contracted them to conduct a boundary survey near the Zone of Si-lence, neither hesitated. They'd heard the stories: compasses gone wild, radios dead, strange lights. But to men who had made their living in the open, the desert's dangers were just another part of the job. The first day went smoothly. Their instruments worked as expected, the sun beat down without mercy, and the nights were black and clear. But as they pushed deeper into the zone's unmarked interior, subtle changes began to creep in. It started with their compasses. Daniel noticed it first. The needle trembled, quivered, and then spun lazily, unable to settle on north. Miguel laughed it off, tapping the glass, but his own compass soon followed. They switched to the backups. The same result. Even their wristwatches began to misbehave, the second hand stuttering and then drifting backward for minutes at a time. By the third day, their careful notes began to show discrepancies. Landmarks shifted in position. Distances seemed longer or shorter than they had walked. They tried triangulating their location using the sun's position, but each attempt led to a different set of coordinates. Still, they pressed on. They were professionals, and they had each other. On the fourth night, Miguel began writing in his journal about a feeling he couldn't name, as if something just beyond his vision was moving in tandem with them, matching their pace. Daniel teased him for letting the legends get under his skin. But when Daniel read his own journal entry the next morning, he found sentences he didn't remember writing. "The ground breathes here. You can feel it if you stand still long enough." The handwriting was his, the ink from his pen, but the words were alien to him. By the fifth day, tension had begun to erode their camaraderie. Small disagreements over navigation turned into sharp words. Miguel accused Daniel of deliberately altering their readings. Daniel accused Miguel of losing track of their samples. Both began sleeping lighter, waking often in the night to check their gear. The journals became stranger. Miguel's once neat script grew cramped and jagged, filling margins with symbols and spirals. Daniel began sketching shapes he couldn't name, rings within rings, lines that curved into impossible geometries. Neither mentioned these changes aloud, as if speaking of them would make them more real. On the seventh day, a sandstorm came without warning. The wind roared for a moment and then fell silent, leaving the air heavy and still. In that stillness, both men claimed later to have heard a faint, deliberate sound. Not the rush of wind or the shifting of dunes, but a slow, measured heartbeat. They didn't speak of it then, but something shifted between them afterward. That night, Miguel woke to find Daniel sitting upright, staring at him. When asked what he was doing, Daniel said nothing at first. Then, in a voice flat and calm, he said, "It doesn't need both of us." The next morning, Miguel's journal contained a single sentence repeated over and over: "It wants one of us." The following day, the killing happened. No one knows exactly how it unfolded. When rescuers found them weeks later, Daniel was wandering alone at the edge of the zone, clothes torn, lips cracked, carrying both his own compass and Miguel's. Miguel's body lay miles away, half buried in the sand, no sign of struggle except for the bruises around his throat. Daniel offered no explanation. He claimed he had no memory of the final days, only that they'd argued and then nothing. His journals from that period were illegible, page after page of erratic lines and circles, the words breaking apart into scrawls. Forensic tests showed no drugs, no signs of dehydration severe enough to cause delirium. But the compasses taken from Daniel's pack behaved oddly even outside the zone, their needles turning slowly as though still lost. The case became known among locals as Los Asesinatos de la Brújula, the compass murders. Officially, it was ruled a crime born of isolation and stress, the kind that happens when men spend too long in harsh conditions. But those who know the zone's stories saw it differently. They said something in the desert had chosen between them, that the spinning needles and backward clocks were not failures of equipment, but signs of a choice being made. And in Miguel's final journal, the last full entry remains a riddle no investigator has been able to solve. Just 4 words, written in a steady hand despite the chaos on the surrounding pages. "It wants one of us." The desert keeps many secrets, but the deepest are the ones it buries in silence. For decades, the Zone of Si-lence had been a place of strange stories. Compasses spinning, voices carried on no wind, falling stars that refused to shatter. Yet until the spring of 2006, all those stories belonged to the surface. That year, for the first time, someone looked beneath. It began with a geological survey team from the Universidad Nacional sent to study subterranean water channels on the zone's southern edge. The work was routine until one of the researchers, operating a ground-penetrating radar unit, noticed something unusual: a broad, symmetrical shape beneath the sand. At first, they thought it might be a buried meteorite, but the image on the radar screen was too regular, too perfect. It was circular, nearly 100 meters in diameter, with edges that curved in flawless arcs. Around its perimeter were evenly spaced protrusions, like the teeth of an immense gear. More unsettling still, the readings suggested the object wasn't just sitting there inert. It was emitting a faint but consistent electromagnetic signal. The team leader, Professor Laura Echeverria, had been to the zone before, and she knew its tendency to distort instruments. But the signal was not random interference. It pulsed. Every 7 seconds, a soft spike in the readings appeared, as steady as a heartbeat. Word of the find spread quickly through academic circles, and within weeks, the research team was joined by engineers, physicists, and a small detachment of military personnel. Theories began to fly. Some insisted it was the wreckage of an alien craft buried centuries or millennia ago. Others speculated it was an ancient Earth-made weapon, something built by a civilization lost to history. A few suggested it might be a geological formation of magnetic ore, though even they admitted nature rarely worked in such perfect symmetry. Locals had their own ideas. Old ranchers nodded gravely and said the object was part of the machine under the desert, a phrase they claimed their grandparents had used, warning children never to dig too deep in certain places. The elders of nearby villages spoke more quietly still, saying it was the heart of the zone itself, and that the hum was its breathing. By late summer, the team was ready to begin a formal excavation. Camp was set up directly above the site, with rows of tents, generator units, and stacks of drilling equipment. The hum, though inaudible to most, seemed to press faintly on the air, a presence you could feel more than hear. Some of the workers complained of headaches. Others began dreaming of endless corridors lined with black metal, lit by a pale light without a source. As the drilling commenced, strange anomalies appeared. The electromagnetic pulses grew stronger the deeper they went, until handheld radios in camp began picking up faint clicks that matched the hum's rhythm. Digital watches lost minutes and then gained them back. A compass placed on the sand above the object spun slowly, never stopping. On the 4th day of drilling, one of the engineers shouted for the machinery to be cut. His instruments were showing that the ground temperature around the borehole was dropping sharply, several degrees in less than an hour. Yet when they touched the drill bit, it was warm. That night, Professor Echeverria sat in her tent reviewing the radar images. The object, she noticed, was not perfectly flat. At its center, slightly raised, was a smaller circle, a disc within the larger one, and from it radiated narrow channels, like spokes. It was a design, not an accident. The next morning, they began the final stage of drilling. The bit was less than 2 meters from the object when the hum changed. It deepened, slowing until the 7-second pulse stretched to 10, then 12. The air in camp felt heavier. Workers moved more slowly, as though wading through unseen water. And then, at precisely 2:14 in the afternoon, the hum stopped. It did not fade or weaken. It ended, as if a switch had been thrown. In the same instant, every electronic device in camp died. The drills froze mid-turn, their motors dead. Radios went silent. Laptops went black. Even the satellite phone, kept for emergencies, gave nothing but dead air. The camp was plunged into a silence far deeper than any they had experienced before, a silence that pressed into their ears until they could hear only the rush of their own blood. Some swore they could feel a faint vibration in the soles of their feet, as though something below was still moving. Attempts to restart the generators failed. The fuel was fine, the machinery intact, but nothing would hold a charge. Night fell without light. By morning, some of the equipment began to function again, though erratically. But the hum never returned. The excavation was halted by military order within 48 hours. All notes, images, and samples were confiscated. The site was covered over, the sand smoothed as though nothing had disturbed it. Officially, the buried structure was dismissed as a natural magnetic anomaly. Unofficially, those who had been there knew better. They had stood above something vast and deliberate, something that had been humming beneath the desert for longer than anyone could remember, and had chosen, in that moment, to go silent. Professor Echevarria never returned to the zone. But in her private papers, recovered after her death, there was a final sketch of the object. Around the edge of the drawing, she had written a single sentence. "It heard us." The Zone of Si-lence was always a fixed point on the map, or so people thought. A place you could mark, avoid, or seek, depending on your appetite for danger. But in the winter of 2015, a team of geomagnetic researchers made a discovery that overturned that certainty and replaced it with something far more troubling. The zone was moving, and it was growing. It began as routine analysis. Every few years, the Mexican Geophysical Institute released updated satellite data on magnetic anomalies across the country. Most changes were gradual, a matter of degrees. But when Dr. Santiago Marroquin compared the latest readings to those from a decade earlier, he saw something impossible. The dense, circular core of the zone's anomaly, the region where compasses spun and radios died, had doubled in size. It was not just spreading outward evenly. The shape had warped, elongating in one direction, as though something beneath the earth was pushing it along a deliberate path. Areas that had once been safe now swallowed radio waves as easily as the zone's center. Marroquin at first assumed a data error. He ran the analysis again. The results were the same. He cross-referenced with European Space Agency measurements. Identical. He even checked against old Soviet-era survey maps from the 1980s, which showed the zone as a much smaller blotch in the desert. The conclusion was inescapable. Whatever force lay at the heart of the zone, it was expanding. It didn't take long for the expansion to make itself known on the ground. Farmers working land at the zone's edges began reporting strange malfunctions. Pump motors died without cause. Weather radios went silent mid-broadcast. Most unsettling were the whispers, faint voices heard late at night through the irrigation pipes, as if the water itself carried messages. One farmer, a man named Luis Ortega, told of standing in his fields before dawn when he heard his own name echo faintly from the mouth of a pipe. He bent closer, thinking it a trick of wind. But there was no wind, only a low murmur that grew into a wordless hum. The next morning, the pump attached to that pipe refused to start. Stories spread quickly. Mechanics couldn't keep electronics running in the affected areas for more than a few weeks before they failed. Some households abandoned radios entirely, claiming they only picked up static and the occasional burst of voices speaking in a language no one recognized. By the summer of 2016, the government quietly expanded the zone of anomalous magnetic activity on official geological maps. The change was small on paper, but for those living near the new border, it meant the silence had crept closer to their homes. Marroquin was not content to leave it at that. With a team of graduate students, he began a series of covert field scans, driving along the desert's back roads and using portable magnetometers to trace the anomaly's edges. What they found was even more disturbing. The magnetic field at the zone's boundary did not fade gradually into normality. It shifted abruptly, as though crossing an unseen wall. The wall was not static. Over the course of weeks, its position changed, always in the same direction, northeast. When the team plotted the shifts on a map, the projected path intersected the outskirts of a city, Torian, in less than 20 years. It became clear that the zone was not just an expanding hazard. It was heading somewhere. Theories multiplied. Some scientists speculated that whatever lay buried beneath the zone, whether ancient machinery, a geological anomaly, or something not of this earth, was migrating through the substrata. Others whispered about the breathing patterns of the zone, suggesting the expansion was only part of a larger cycle. The most unsettling idea was that the zone's growth was intentional, like a predator closing the distance to its prey. Meanwhile, the human effects multiplied. Field researchers stationed along the boundary began reporting dreams of places they had never seen, vast plains of dark sand, broken by metallic spires. One woman described walking endlessly toward a pale light on the horizon, only to wake and find herself standing in her backyard, barefoot, with no memory of leaving her bed. Equipment failures became so common in the expansion zone that some scientists switched to paper logs and analog instruments. Even these were unreliable. Compasses spun, watches ran backward. A few researchers claimed to have seen figures at the boundary line, 3 silhouettes, tall and unmoving, watching from within the shimmer of heat that hung over the desert floor. The whispers in the pipes became louder. Farmers abandoned some wells entirely, sealing them with concrete after hearing what they swore were children's voices calling from the depths. By 2018, Marroquin's private scans showed the zone's core pulsing, its magnetic intensity rising and falling in long, slow cycles. Each peak in the pulse coincided with a small jump in the expansion rate, as if the zone gathered strength before pushing further. When he presented his findings at a closed-door academic meeting, the room fell silent. One colleague asked if he'd calculated the anomaly's trajectory. Marroquin nodded. Then he showed the final scan, the one taken just 2 weeks earlier. The projected path had shifted. The zone was no longer headed toward Torian in 20 years. It was on course to reach the city's outer districts in less than half that time. And worse, the anomaly's leading edge was no longer smooth. It had developed smaller protrusions, fingers of magnetic distortion reaching outward into the surrounding land, probing, testing. Marroquin closed the presentation with a single sentence: "It is coming toward us." No one in the room argued. On the edge of the Zone of Si-lence, there once stood a small AM radio station, XC31, its single-story concrete shell baked pale by decades of desert sun. It was not glamorous. Its audience was modest. But for the scattered ranchers, truck drivers, and night watchmen within range, it was a lifeline of weather reports, local news, and music to keep the darkness company. In October of last year, it became something else entirely. The station's final broadcast began on an ordinary Tuesday night. The DJ on duty was a man named Ramon Castillo, a voice familiar to listeners for his warm baritone and easy laughter. He was joined that night by 2 technicians, Jorge and Anita, who handled the late shift maintenance. The schedule was routine: 3 hours of mixed music, a midnight news roundup, and the station's customary sign-off. But at 10:43 p.m., Ramon interrupted a song mid-verse. His voice came over the air, calm but edged with something listeners could not quite place. "Folks," he said, "if you're awake, I think you should step outside and look to the south." Reports from that night say the desert sky was moonless, the air so clear that stars seemed close enough to touch. But in the southern horizon, lights had appeared, at first 3, then 5, then 7, moving slowly in perfect formation. They were not aircraft. There was no engine noise, no blinking navigation beacons. They moved like dancers, weaving and shifting positions with impossible precision. The station's signal wavered for a moment, dropping into a low hiss before Ramon's voice returned. He laughed nervously. "Sorry about that. We're having some interference here." Jorge swears he can feel it in his teeth. By 11:15, the lights had drawn closer. Anita, speaking off mic, could be heard asking if they should call someone. Ramon told her to keep the phone lines open. But then the phone system died, replaced by a faint, rhythmic clicking that matched the tempo of the station's signal interference. Outside, the lights had formed a wide arc, encircling the horizon. Then came the shapes. At first, they were only silhouettes against the starlight, tall, thin figures walking steadily across the open desert toward the station. Listeners later described hearing Anita gasp on air, followed by Jorge muttering a prayer in Spanish. Ramon's voice stayed steady, though the words themselves began to distort, stretching unnaturally as if dragged out by invisible hands. "This is not a drill," he said, each syllable warping. "We have visitors." Some listeners claimed they could hear other voices beneath his, speaking in a language they didn't recognize, layered over his speech, not replacing it, like 2 signals bleeding into each other. By 11:42, the distortion worsened. Music tracks played at the wrong speed, news clips looped back on themselves. Through it all, the station kept transmitting, though at times it was only static and the faint hum that so many in the zone knew too well. The last coherent segment came just after midnight. Ramon's voice was close to the mic, quieter now. "They're almost here," he said. "Anita says she can see their faces now." "You don't think they're—" The words cut off. A rush of static followed, then a long, low tone that listeners later described as vibrating in their bones. At 12:03 a.m., the broadcast ended. The carrier signal went dead. When rescue teams arrived 3 days later, they found the station intact. Doors unlocked, equipment undamaged. Chairs pushed back from the console as if the crew had simply stood up and walked away. The coffee in the pot was cold, the soundboard still switched to on air. The microphones were warm to the touch. There were no footprints leading away from the building. Inside the recording booth, the digital logs showed the broadcast had continued for nearly an hour after the crew's final words. But the files contained nothing but a single sustained hum, steady and unbroken, until the moment the signal stopped. The investigation concluded without answers. Officially, the disappearance was labeled unexplained. Unofficially, the locals say the zone came for them, not with sudden violence, but with the patience it has always shown. The station building still stands, though no one broadcasts from it now. Some nights, travelers claim that if you park nearby and tune an old analog radio to XZ31's frequency, you can still hear faint voices. They fade in and out, stretch thin, speaking words you almost recognize but never quite understand. And beneath it all, there is that same distant hum, steady as a heartbeat in the sand. And so the Zone of Si-lence drifts back into shadow, its secrets buried once more beneath sand and starlight. The compasses have stopped spinning, the last echoes of the hum have faded into the night, and the desert waits, patient as ever. But you know now, some truths do not vanish. They simply wait for the right moment to be heard again. Perhaps you will hear it first, the whisper through a radio no one has touched in years, the shimmer of light on a horizon that should be dark, the feeling that something beneath your feet is older than the world you stand on. If you've walked with me this far into the unknown, let the path not end here. There are more deserts to cross, more lost cities to uncover, more ancient voices to follow into the dark. Leave your mark before you go. Share your thoughts in the comments, pass this story to someone who hungers for mystery, and let your curiosity be the compass. And if you have not yet joined our circle of travelers, do so now. Subscribe and step with us into the next forgotten place, the next shadowed map, the next chapter of what should never have been found. The desert is vast, and the silence is spreading. Will you be here when it calls again?